You don't need me to tell you that in the West, music is a fundamental part of popular culture. It's a sign of the changing times, a reaction to current events, and self-expression. Apart from radio and FCC regulations, popular music in the West has been distributed and marketed pretty freely. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, however, the music industry looked pretty different. The Soviet Union had music, of course, but it was heavily regulated. In order to get your name out there as a Soviet musician, you had to be officially recognized by the government and follow strict censorship rules. And it mostly sounded like this. But underneath the government-sanctioned, communist-friendly sounds of the Soviet radio, there persisted a low dirge in the underground, made by real people with real emotions and real anger. So, armed with Google Translate and my loose understanding of Russian history, I invite you in joining me to take a look at the illegal production, circulation, and legacy of underground Soviet music, and celebrate the musicians who persisted, despite never having a chance at commercial success, and some of whom went as far as to risk their livelihoods for the art they created. Under Stalin in the 1930s, popular Soviet music was a prestigious profession reserved exclusively for classical composers for symphonies and operas. You'd think this would make censorship rather easy, as there typically isn't much to censor, other than perhaps the odd D sus9 chord or alto clef, but this would be incorrect, as even classical music has proven to be quite controversial and political. For example, most of legendary composer Stravinsky's music was banned all the way up until the 60s, and his highly experimental and avant-garde Rite of Spring reached a little too far outside the box. And this was far from an isolated incident, as the same thing happened to Shostakovich. As the same thing happened to Shostakovich for Lady Macbeth of Msensk, despite the opera receiving initial success. The only permitted form of art was known as social realism. It was an art form meant to depict and reflect on the truthful reality, and nothing else. And for the Soviet Union, that reality was socialism. To put it simply, this meant being sure to always depict the proletariat as the heroes, and all music, new or old, had to fall within these guidelines. It also needed to be simple and easy to remember to facilitate a sense of unity and nationalism. In 1932, Stalin formed the Union of Composers as part of the Cultural Revolution and five-year economic plan. Their job was to further enrich and advance Soviet culture through state-sanctioned music. They would be responsible for composing, performing, and recording music, as well as distributing and copyrighting the music with it. This was the first government music organization of the Soviet Union. The organization would be rebranded many times, but the goals remained largely the same: keep socialism and the proletariat at the forefront. Once the 60s rolled around, state-sponsored music evolved to resemble popular music of the West and appeal to the youth of the decade. Jazz rock, new wave, and disco-inspired groups combined traditional music with new-aged instruments to uphold the same social realist values. They became known as vocal instrument ensembles, which emerged from the former Union of Composers. This was the time of the space race. Musical innovations were being explored and engineers were developing groundbreaking synthesizers. Electronic, ethereal sounds welcomed in an air of optimism for the technological future, and popular music began reflecting that. These VIA groups sometimes reached up to 10 members, all of which were highly educated in music theory and had years of professional performance under their belts. Some even utilized guitars and theremins, itself also a Soviet innovation.
О, как нелегок этот путь, согласно правилам игры, мы быть обязаны одни.
There was only a single official record label, that being Melodia, established in 1964, which of course was government-run. Those who were not signed with Melodia were not considered official nor approved. The way these groups operated also became more refined. Each group had its own director that managed the group entirely, sometimes even writing the songs themselves. They also worked as a state supervisor to ensure that everything the group produced was deemed appropriate according to Soviet law. Groups were only allowed to write about universal and generalized experiences, such as that of falling in love, feelings of happiness and sadness, or nostalgia for a greater nation. Otherwise, it had to fall on the more explicitly patriotic side. Sometimes VIAs would perform foreign hits, so long as the lyrics were changed to be socialist-friendly, and they sometimes even claimed the songs as their own. Furthermore, each group had to follow a strict dress code, mostly chalked up to suits, military uniforms, or other national garb. They also weren't allowed to dance too much on stage or make too much of a spectacle. In the 80s, rock and roll reached the Soviet Union. Heavily influenced by the phenomenon of Beatlemania. Ironically, Back in the USSR was in fact banned along with the rest of the Beatles' discography, despite its sympathetic portrayal of the USSR, which simultaneously caused controversy in the US. However, rock music was not supported by the state, and much harder to participate in. At this time, the label of rock music was strictly avoided due to its bourgeoisie connotations. Aquarium and Autograph are credited with being the pioneers of Russian rock and are now household names, despite being unauthorized for decades. Aquarium is a band with quite a diverse discography. They can only be described as an experimental rock band, as through their over 40 years of operation and counting, they've dipped into folk, psychedelia, reggae, punk, blues, and new wave. I mean, they even have a bassoon player.
Сплотимся гордо в круг родного флага, и пусть кипит утешая вода.
Along with their eclectic sound, they have a theatrical air to them and certainly know how to put on a show, as the band caused quite an outrage at the Tbilisi Rock Festival, the first state-sanctioned festival, after singer Jabranjikov went a little too crazy on stage and caused him to lose his job and get expelled from the festival, citing the promotion of homosexuality through his dance moves with his guitar. On other occasions, the band would refuse to play until attendees who had been detained for dancing were allowed back into the show, which also caused quite a stir with the KGB. Needless to say, their oppositional stance to the restrictions placed on their music did little but empower them and the alternative Soviet counterculture they've amassed.
Russians are assaulting America, but the weapons of choice are electric guitars.
Autograph, another art rock band, was a particularly unique sound for the Soviet underground. And no, not that Autograph. This Autograph was much more focused on instrumentation rather than metaphorical or symbolic lyrics, which were more typical of other Soviet bands. The closest I can come to a Western comparison for these guys is Styx, and once you listen to yourself, you'll see what I mean. As an aside, I normally wouldn't interject a comparison to another group, especially that of a Western group, because this music is original work that stands on its own and doesn't need the assistance of familiarity. But in this context, the influence is important to the formation of the Russian rock scene, so recognizing the parts that have been extracted and transformed may actually be beneficial. Moving on. Autograph became the first Soviet band to meet commercial success in the West and even performed for Live Aid in 1984 via broadcast, which is insane.
Ты очень умный век, но горе от ума. Тому, кто видеть перестал, грань добра и зла.
Early Russian rock, aside for its heavy American and European influence, was also inspired by traditional bard music, a Russian term for singer-songwriter-style folk music, which came from old folk tales and were often performed by poets and academics. However, in the eyes of the government, these two genres had to remain separate, since the very idea of rock music was inherently anti-Soviet. Unofficial rock bands performed in apartments, with homemade instruments and jerry-rigged equipment. The typical apartment show was acoustic to keep noise levels down. At unsanctioned shows, KGB raids happened often. Equipment and instruments were confiscated and destroyed, and fans and musicians were sent to prison. Shoddy recordings of these shows and bootlegged records popped up in circulation by copyists. For a lot of these bands, this was the only way to circulate your music. This was also the only way to hear foreign records, if you weren't up for doing the smuggling yourself. This process became known as magnetizdat, a term derived from samizdat, which was the practice of self-publishing and distributing illegal and underground written publications. Since printing presses and typewriters required registration, this was mostly done manually. Similarly, reel-to-reel tape recordings were most commonly used for commercial distribution in Russia at this point, so Japanese and Western magnetic tape recorders had to be acquired from black market and secondhand shops. When such materials were unavailable, copyists had to get creative. Bone music, or music on the ribs, was an alternative method of bootlegging illegal music and home recording. Using old phonographs, copyists pressed copies of records into discarded X-ray film, cut them into 7-inch discs, and burned a hole into the center with a cigarette in order to be played like typical records. Though the quality was terrible and only lasted for a few plays, they were cheap to produce and only cost a few rubles for the buyer. And it's cool as fuck. I thought they were so cool, in fact, that I found and bought one myself. Most that are preserved today mostly have Western music on them, like the Beatles, Hendrix, that sort of thing. But I found this one. This one has a song on it from the 1930s, with the translated title, Tell Me Girls, by Latvian folk singer Konstantin Sokolski. My original plan was to digitize this and include it here, so you could get a sense for the quality of the record, but unfortunately, due to its unconventional shape, it is unable to spin properly on my record player. I'm on the lookout for other options, as I would really like to avoid altering it from its original hand-cut shape. So if I manage to get it converted, I will upload the song in its full to this channel and link it right here. Anyway, back in the day, if you wanted to take the far less cool route to listen to your musical contraband, you had to smuggle in the records from the West, or be lucky enough to catch a stray signal from your radio, from the BBC, or US international broadcasts after Lyndon B. Johnson. If you were lucky enough to be able to tune in, this was cause for celebration. Call the whole family in and indulge in the strange sounds of the world beyond the motherland. And if you were technically inclined, you can even record these broadcasts straight from the radio. A defining moment for these underground bands was the opening of the Leningrad Rock Club in 1981, thanks in part to Perestroika, Gorbachev's reform movement to combat the USSR's economic, political, and social stagnation. In short, Perestroika allowed for more freedom to make independent market decisions. While the reform program created a lot of political tension, as many saw it as adapting to the capitalist ways of the West, but simultaneously upheld some strict regulations, it allowed for the beginnings of a more socially recognized music scene and gave bands a level of creative freedom that was completely out of the question previously. This was monumental for Soviet music because of the way it changed these bands were able to operate, and it allowed for new groups to rise. The Leningrad Rock Club, located at 13 Rubinstein Street, was a measly 600-seater, built with the intention of gathering the bands and fans that made up the underground scene in an environment that was easy to monitor. It was located in a bustling cultural area with many landmarks that are preserved as historical icons. The venue was a far cry from anything that would be deemed professional today. Since the KGB came to the realization that they couldn't stop the counterculture from happening, they opted instead to keep it under a close watch in a controlled, contained environment. A committee of musicians selected bands on a case-by-case basis to play, keeping strict rules about who was allowed, while KGB officers monitored the bands and the crowd from balcony seats. Though many groups would be kicked out for performing unsanctioned songs, the claim that lyrical interpretations were simply misunderstood kept some in the game. Other controversial groups were turned away on the basis of their musical abilities if they couldn't clearly clock them for something else. The rock club gave rise to other bands that would have otherwise been deplatformed from the beginning. Legendary group Kino was among these bands, alongside Pop Mechanics, an extremely unusual and wildly ambitious musical collective that incorporated avant-garde theatrics into their performances, like including animals in their show. There was also Televisor, one of the few bands that wrote blatantly political songs, denouncing the acts of the government through their industrial sound. Alyssa, a hard rock group with a long contentious history between the government, fans, and themselves. Strange Games, a new wave group known for their unusual ska influence. It would be an injustice to not dedicate some time to discussing the legacy of post-punk band Kino, since they became somewhat of a poster child for progressive forms of music in the Soviet Union, and largely against frontman Viktor Tsой's wishes at that. Kino formed in Leningrad in 1981. They began like most Soviet bands at the time, tucked away in forms of magnetizdat and student apartment shows. After losing their drummer to the draft, the group was cut down to only 2, and in 1984, their first performance at the Leningrad Rock Club thrust them into stardom, and they even got so far as to tour the Soviet Union. Kino had an unmistakably somber, yet gritty sound that rivaled the alternative and post-punk sounds in the West at the time. Tsой's low, haunting vocals accompanied a stripped-down, yet resonant sound that could be compared to Joy Division, R.E.M., or The Cure as Western counterparts. Their track, I Want Changes, became a staple protest song and rang out across Russian-occupied countries for decades to come. Despite Viktor Tsой's claims that his lyrics were strictly artistic and not meant to be taken with a political understanding, the collective frustration and political unrest of the common Soviet citizen was beginning to boil over, and Tsой's ballad was the battle cry they needed. Obviously, we won't ever know his initial intentions for writing the song, but it is common to cite artistic interpretation in regards to racy lyrics to avoid conflict with the KGB. So even if Kino had written the song out of frustration for Soviet society, they never could have admitted it. This has become such an important track for activists of Russia that it's been shouted in mass protests to every Russian leader since Gorbachev, including Putin on multiple occasions, and multiple Belarusian leaders, outliving the very country it was born out of. In 1990, tragedy swept over the music scene of the USSR when Viktor Tsoj lost his life in a car accident, leaving Russian rockers to mourn the gravelly voice of the Soviet people. But they are far from forgotten, with Kino's legacy remaining as a celebrated figure of perseverance in the name of art. In 1986, a very considerable compilation album would surprisingly become available on store shelves on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Red Wave, 4 underground bands from the USSR, curated and created by American musician Joanna Stingray, in partnership with Aquarium, Kino, Alyssa, and Strange Games. This was really the first time Americans had this kind of look into the musical ecosystem of the USSR, and was quite the daring undertaking for Stingray. She started as a tourist seeking out the music scene of Leningrad when she stumbled upon Kino and struck up a friendship with the group, and found a passion for sharing the unique sounds of the Soviet gloom. Followed around by both KGB and FBI agents, she smuggled music back and forth and began filming music videos. In fact, the only official music videos to come from the Soviet music scene, and thus gave these underground bands a new international audience that would have been completely unthinkable before. Watching these videos was such a delightful experience. It's so refreshing to see something made in such earnest and genuine passion compared to the overproduced MTV-ready spectacles we are used to. You can really feel just how excited they all were to be doing this and how much fun they were having, even through the 4 different styles each band decided to go for. I just wanted to throw in how much I love these. While this kind of music remained extremely niche in the West and hardly gained any notoriety at the time, this album attracted other musicians who applauded her effort and were also struck by the mystery of Soviet music. Bowie, upon hearing the album, got in contact with Stingray, offering to help her provide better equipment that was hard to come by in the USSR.
And when I showed Andy the photos of their artwork, and I actually brought 2 of their pieces of artwork with me, Andy lit up, and he was so excited that halfway around the world there was this art that was so inspiring, and it reminded him of the graffiti art like Basquiat and Keith Haring. So I said, hey, Andy, if I go buy some soup, can you sign it to my friends? And he said yes right away. And he didn't know what he was getting into because he literally signed 20 cans. I was spelling out each one of the Russians' names. He signed some books, as you can see. And this photo is of the rockers and the new painters, who were this collective of artists that were also in many of the rock groups. So it was needless to say, they were thrilled when they got all of the Warhol stuff. But I will say, I was shocked the day after I gave them all the cans of soup. I went to their apartments the next day and could not believe that they had all opened it and ate the soup. And they said, yeah, we love that the can was signed by Warhol, but we wanted to know what American soup tasted like.
The same would be true of our next important topic of discussion. In 1988, the Scorpions were granted permission to tour the Soviet Union with a total of 10 dates in both Leningrad and Moscow, including the famed Leningrad Rock Club. This was the first instance of Western rock and roll as we know it being permitted inside the Iron Curtain. The band would be the first American band permitted to tour the USSR in 1976, and Cliff Richard would technically be the first Western rock artist to visit the USSR a few months prior. The Scorpions was a far cry from the bluegrassy, easygoing country pop rock that was deemed acceptable enough just 12 years prior. The German band's visit was a monumental step, letting a foreign rock band of their capacity perform for the Soviet people, who knew they were experiencing something special with these shows, as did the Scorpions. They would come back to tour again, and when reflecting on the experience, frontman Klaus Meine had this to say. For me, the biggest change was when we saw all the authorities, all the security, Red Army soldiers, military, in the stadium. We started playing, they turned around, and they became part of the fans. They celebrated rock and roll, and they celebrated this Western rock as much as the fans did. They threw their caps and jackets in the air, and they were being part of the audience, and it felt for us like the world was changing in front of our eyes. In 1991, the world watched the dissolution of the Soviet Union. While I wouldn't go as far as to say music was responsible, it did play a role in uniting its people during a time of unrest and became an important tool to express the desire for change. Like any artistic movement, it is an important documentation of the progress of insurgents and to observe the mindset of the new generation. It was a tool of revolution. While the sound was inspired by Western rock, the experiences are hardly comparable. In the US, rock music certainly embraced the spirit of rebellion, but it's largely performative. It's flashy and loud, and it's good fun, sure, and it may turn the heads of pearl clutchers, sure, but in the USSR, in many ways, making music was putting your life on the line. There was a real chance that you had to spend the rest of your life behind bars, both for fans and for musicians. Every piece of unsanctioned art, outwardly political or not, was inherently political, inherently anti-Soviet, and it's more creative and daring because of it. There wasn't this preconceived notion about what standards had to be reached to become popular, because that was never even a factor in the equation. This music didn't just embrace the spirit of rebellion, its very existence was an act of rebellion, which can't be said for most American rock bands. This was a movement led by rebellious youth that ultimately proved to be a triumphant outcry over the strict social rigidity of an obsolete government. And frankly, there's nothing more rock and roll than that. In the post-Soviet era of Russia, a lot of these bands disappeared. Some due to the vast differences of the music and entertainment industry outside of the USSR. Others found success worldwide and continue to tour today, being met with massive crowds, not just in Russia, but everywhere. But for those whose music is permanently stuck in the era of Soviet oppression, let them not be forgotten with the dissolution of a dictatorship. Listen to them with the knowledge that they were shouting against a society that forced them to be silent and compliant, and refuse to let something much bigger than them stifle their creativity, drive, and desire to find others like them, to create a community hidden away from the iron fist of the law. Keep their sound alive, because it's something special to behold that we can never fully understand, in America at least. My name is Circumcision. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you all very soon.